Maybe I've been given a false perception of the frequency of this issue, but if there's one thing that's been glaringly obvious to me regarding the continued discussions of adaptations, reimaginings, or simply derivative media, it's that a lot of these projects see the involvement of people who have little to no particular care about the source material they're working with. Let me back up a bit and provide some context. Over the last several days, I've been catching an aggravating, recurring topic on Twitter. People attempting to add to the legacy of an intellectual property, or perhaps a genre in general, while holding a clear absence of respect for it. It showed up on my timeline in the form of Mrcheese announcing his own video about Rooster Teeth's Genlock, a mecha show that absolutely despises mecha shows. I won't go into much detail so I don't detract from Mrcheese's original video, but basically, Genlock scorns the very genre it's a part of, going so far as to have an in-universe anime that parodies classic 70s and 80s mecha anime by very brashly implying that they're just full of gratuitous violence and sexism. And furthermore, Genlock's art book even contains a completely unironic quote that suggests the show is some sort of superior mecha program because, unlike other shows, this one's about the characters, not the mechs. This would be funny if it weren't so pathetic. It's like no one working on this trash heap ever actually watched a single episode of any of the shows it's poorly attempting to criticize. For some horrible reason, Rooster Teeth allowed people who hated mecha anime to make a mecha anime that was embarrassed to be a mecha anime. The show, specifically Season 2, drips with unfiltered contempt for its own predecessors that allowed it to exist in the first place. If you want to know more and perhaps even descend into madness alongside Mrcheese, then I recommend checking out the full video. A link is in the description. It's a model example of a niche genre of media being infiltrated by people who hate it. Now let's take a step in the opposite direction while also venturing into the real meat and potatoes of the video. Adaptations. And when I say opposite, I don't mean people who love the source material too much, though that is possible, as shown by some Star Wars media that's a bit too indulgent in its own universe and far too self-referential for its own good. Instead, I'm talking about apathy. People who simply ignore the source material entirely, regardless of their feelings on it. When this happens, the adaptation might contain flashes of brilliance here and there, but those are ultimately drowned out by several specific examples of pure artistic ignorance. And a good example of this is the Halo TV series, which featured some cool visual effects and some incredible action scenes that evoked the feeling of the games, but also many questionable at best creative decisions that conflicted with the games, like constantly revealing Master Chief's face, or renaming New Alexandria to Reach City for some godforsaken reason, or making Master Chief have sex with a prisoner of war while Cortana watches. And to add insult to injury, this show didn't have any real reason to deviate this much from the games to begin with, considering it was co-produced by 343 Industries and had multiple 343 leaders in executive producer positions. Furthermore, both showrunners, Kyle Killen and Stephen Kane, have left production of the series and will not return for Season 2. Killen in particular actually departed before production even began, leaving Kane to do all the heavy lifting himself, for better or for worse. It's one thing to hide and deflect criticism from behind the shield of, well, it's an alternate universe, so it doesn't really clash with the games. But that doesn't mean you should throw away almost every tiny piece of what fans enjoyed about the narrative aspect of the games to begin with, including its themes and character nuances. But I suppose something like this was to be expected when 343 already has that dreadful quote, "We hired people who hated Halo" attached to them. And you have the chief programming officer at Paramount Plus saying this show was a swing for a broad audience that an NFL dad could enjoy with his teenage son. And you have Kane himself saying, "We never looked at the games, so we never felt limited by it being a game." An interesting choice of words there. Limited. It's as if he's suggesting that following the source material would have been more creatively restrictive instead of propping up his hack writing like a crutch he desperately needed. But things don't stop there. The discussion about adaptations and their loyalty to their source material reached a head recently by way of The Witcher. On October 29th, it was announced with very little ceremony that Henry Cavill was departing the Netflix adaptation of the popular book series and handing over the part of Geralt of Rivia to Luke Hemsworth. And if you haven't been watching the show or even keeping up with any discussions of it, then you might wonder, well, what does this have to do with loyalty to the source material? Well, it sort of starts with the fact that the show took immense creative liberties with the content of the books, and more or less from the get-go at that. Season 1 already featured some big deviations, but Season 2 took everything to a whole new level, and this drew passionate criticism from fans of the book. And while I'm a firm believer that deviating from the source material is not an inherent evil, it could end up being a huge mistake if you don't have the writing talent to drive the narrative into a direction that is comparatively compelling. The reason why Henry Cavill's departure is so important here is because he gained a very public reputation of being a huge fan of both the books and the games. And it's become public knowledge that he was essentially a walking encyclopedia of Witcher lore and trivia while he was on the set. He loves this franchise, and being able to act as Geralt is undoubtedly an incredible thing for him, possibly even a dream come true. He personally lobbied for this role very hard, so why did he leave? It's easy to assume that he might have left to become Superman again, as was recently announced. And that might be partly true, because at the end of the day, we don't know the scope of his return. But unless he's doing multiple movies back to back, I honestly don't see why that would cause that big of a conflict with the show. And typically, if cast changes are caused by scheduling conflicts, it would be clarified fairly quickly. The biggest theory, however, is that Henry left because he was simply tired of constantly being at odds with the people running the show. In a very short window of time in late 2021, Henry gave multiple comments that he's a big supporter of the show staying as faithful to the books as possible. He's even gotten into disagreements with the showrunner, Lauren Hissrich, about his character and how he would act in certain situations. Henry stated he was completely committed to the show's 7-season plan on the singular condition that it tells great stories which honor Sapkowski's work. Why would Henry leave a role he busted his ass for? A role that he cared about on a personal level and sought after completely on his own free will? Well, signs point to the reason being that this one condition just wasn't met. And to drive this point home, one of the writers for the show, Beau DeMayo, who is now a writer for the upcoming X-Men 97, stated that the writing team for The Witcher had some members who actively disliked the books and games, and sometimes went out of their way to even mock them. He says it was a recipe for disaster and bad morale. He ends the thought by making a pretty poignant statement. You have to respect the work before you're allowed to add to its legacy. Now, that sounds like a great sentiment, and I do agree with the spirit of it, but it's not really a hard and fast rule. At the end of the day, it's possible to be a big fan and still come up short, and to hold no love for a property, yet still make a decent addition to it. But that requires some serious artistic instinct and experience. For example, Tony Gilroy has gone on record to state that he's not some sort of Star Wars superfan, yet he was able to create the recent, critically acclaimed Andor series. I mentioned earlier that Star Wars has an awful habit of being too indulgent and self-referential of its own universe for its own good. and Disney scored a creator who completely ignored that approach, and the outcome was great. On the more extreme end, you have Paul Verhoeven's adaptation of Starship Troopers, screenplay written by Ed Neumeyer, which was actively disrespectful of Robert Heinlein's book. The argument could be made that Verhoeven and Neumeyer were not trying to add to the book's legacy. They instead were trying to tear it down. But they had the ambition and understanding of the source material to do that. And I think that would be a better way to phrase Beau DeMayo's statement. Whether you wish to add to an intellectual property's legacy or tear it down with spite, you need to at least understand it if you want to accomplish your goal. You have to understand the intent behind its creation, its themes, its goals as a piece of media or art, and the things its fans like about it the most and why. This is all crucial information if you wish to positively contribute to the property's history, or adequately dissect and satirize it. And the refusal to gain these understandings is the core of the issue here. It's hubris. To think that you can surpass the source material in any way, harboring a contempt for it, while also refusing to understand any type of intention or appeal it might have, is pure hubris. To be hired to adapt something you have no interest in learning about because it seemed limiting, pedestrian, or beneath you, and pushing forward anyway because you think you can fix it or do better, is pure hubris. To create a new piece of media that holds disdain for its peers and predecessors, and self-loathing because it shares a space with them, all while showcasing a total lack of understanding of why they were important, is pure hubris. A lack of understanding can quickly turn into a lack of humility, and a lack of humility causes mistakes like these. You don't need to be a die-hard fan of the franchise or genre. In fact, you can hate it for all I care. But you need to at least display a semblance of an understanding of and goodwill towards what it is you are adapting or adding to. Apathy or even contempt for the property or your predecessors and peers has no place here, especially if you're arrogant enough to not even hide that contempt in the final product. I know I'm sounding like an asshole who thinks he could run a big budget production all by himself, and I don't mean to, but it's hard to not be aggravated when this shit seems to be happening so often in such a recent time frame. The newest seasons for each of the shows I talked about in this video aren't even a full year old yet, and they're all miraculously guilty of similar things. It's mind-boggling. Is it really so difficult for big production companies to put more than zero effort into vetting potential writing talent in a way that prevents these scornful hacks from sinking their claws into a property they don't even understand, yet still mock and seek to fix? How many times does this have to happen? How many more books or video games are going to get awful adaptations because of this? How many more niche genres are going to be infiltrated by people who despise all the classics? It is fucking exhausting. And yet this problem seems to run far too deep to actually solve. But, you know, if there's one tiny little silver lining here, it's that all this bullshit has made me appreciate the rare adaptation that actually manages to knock it out of the park. Like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. It truly is a miracle those ended up being even close to as good as they are. The stars really aligned. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the worrying trend of we hired people who hate the source material. Cross your fingers that a thing you love will never receive this treatment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.